TurboGrafx16 was no stranger to shooters. In Japan, the PC Engine was one of the greatest shooting consoles of all time, but even in the US, where only a fraction of those games saw release, there were still a handful that flew under the radar and were overlooked. And my friend, Johnny Graphics, obviously also a huge fan of the system, with a name like that, has a very intimate relationship with the games. Exclusively for this channel, he's put together a great video showcasing his top 5 most underrated TG16 shooters. I'm currently hard at work on my next video, every Sega Saturn shooter reviewed. But as you know, that's a lot of work. So in the meantime, please enjoy this spotlight of underrated shooters. His knowledge and love for the games speaks for itself. So I'll let Johnny Graphics take it from here.
Now, none of us are strangers to the fact that the TurboGrafx has a lot of great shooters. That's pretty much what the platform's mostly known for at this point. But despite the Turbo's relatively small library, there's still a lot of shmups within it that are often overlooked and underrated. Now, sometimes that treatment is warranted, Deep Blue, but sometimes it's not, so let's not be hasty. There's several great shooters on this system beyond the blazing lasers and the airzonks and the R-types that are well worth your time. And despite some of them having some rough edges here and there, maybe being a bit of an acquired taste, upon a closer look, you never know. Some of these could very well wind up being one of your favorites. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that Sinistron is the best shooter on the TurboGrafx, or even particularly close to that, but I do think it has more than enough going for it, both in terms of personality and overall production value, to be worthy of more credit than it tends to get. The main thing that sets it apart is the ship's jaws, as the manual refers to them, but I feel like it's more of a beak, so I'll call it that instead. You can open up your ship's beak to increase the spread of your fire, but in so doing you weaken your weapon slightly and also expose the more vulnerable cockpit. The beak will absorb some enemy fire, so keeping it closed whenever possible is the safest bet. But if you're getting overwhelmed, as you eventually will, opening up the beak to either of its other 2 positions will help you take enemies out faster, usually. The game makes you use your best judgment to determine how defensive or offensive you want to be at any given time, and gives you the flexibility to do that as long as your weapon is upgraded. This gives Sinistron an interesting vibe that most shmups don't quite have. Maybe it clicks with you, maybe it doesn't, but at the very least, it's a neat concept. Sinistron's 3 weapons are the flame cannon, the laser, and the homing missiles, all of which do slightly different levels of damage, but again, the position of the beak is far more impactful than the weapon you have equipped in my experience. I feel like the laser is pretty good in most situations, but you could get by with any of them, so it mostly does come down to preference, which I like. Some shooters effectively require certain weapons in certain situations, and if you don't know what's coming up next, that can be really annoying, so I like that Sinistron doesn't do that. You also have a chargeable blast that you can use by turning the turbo switch down and holding onto the fire button for a couple of seconds. It's kind of a measly little thing though, it doesn't do much damage, and it has a pretty small radius, so it's almost never really worth doing outside of maybe a couple situations. Kind of a wasted opportunity there. Speed pickups and shield pods are also very important in Sinistron, and yes, you will lose all of them every time you die, which will definitely happen a lot, as Sinistron gets absolutely brutal by stage 4. The first and second levels are pushovers, 3 is a moderate challenge, and then from stage 4's asteroid field and on, you'll be getting bombarded on a nearly constant basis. Sinistron gets so hard that it's actually one of the few Turbo games I've never legitimately beaten. I've only been able to get to this level before I start losing my mind. I have a great time up until then though. Sinistron's graphics are quite good in my opinion, and are one of its strongest elements, with lots of vibrant colors and parallax scrolling layers, at least in the first couple stages, and great use of different palettes giving each stage an extremely distinct vibe. I really like the way stage 3 looks in particular, like you're in some kind of a glowing neon intestinal tract. Pretty neat. Every stage has a cool look to it though, and it's worth admiring the work that Alpha System put into them. They managed to make this game in less than a year after releasing Cybercore, which is still probably the better game overall, but the massive leap in visuals from Cybercore to Sinistron is undeniable. They also totally nailed the music here too. Again, Sinistron carves out its own weird and interesting identity with music that evokes the strangeness of an alien world, but still keeps the energy high, just like it did in Cybercore. Most of the tracks here seem to harken back to the same melodic theme, which is kind of an interesting direction compositionally for a video game, and yet the songs still manage to match their levels individually, so I'm impressed. I wasn't able to find out who wrote the music in Sinistron, as the names in the credits are all pseudonyms, but whoever you are, great work. NEC apparently thought Sinistron had a good shot at being a thing, since they did give it a front-page illustration in TurboPlay magazine, but it would immediately get blown out of the water by shoot-em-ups on other systems, and even other shooters on the Turbo. So there just wasn't really room for Sinistron to have the spotlight long enough to make much of an impact. It made an impact on me though. While I don't really like how absurdly difficult it gets, and it probably wouldn't even crack my top 10 Turbo games, it'll still always have a spot among shmups that I like, and I occasionally recommend to people, especially those that are looking for something a little different. Dead Moon is easily one of the most underrated TurboGrafx games in the entire library, and I think I understand why. It starts off kind of benign, and honestly sort of unimpressive, with generic space backgrounds and cityscapes, and when combined with the somewhat steep and sudden difficulty curve, I can see why some people might opt to put the game down in favor of something else after a few minutes or so. This is a mistake though. Once Dead Moon really gets going, by the third stage or so, it explodes into one of the better shooters on the system, with increasingly elaborate level and enemy designs, outstanding music, and some truly memorable boss fights. The way Dead Moon handles background layers is also particularly skillful. This moon level in particular looks absolutely insane. I don't even know how many background layers there are here. They blend so well together, it just kind of looks like a rolling lunar landscape, like it's supposed to. And once you get past the midway point or so, the use of color and implementation of crazier enemies continues to intensify, and it just becomes increasingly obvious that the first couple of levels just aren't a very good representation of this game as a whole. Now, I'm not sure why Dead Moon backloads the vast majority of its awesomeness in the second half of the game. Perhaps they shouldn't have done that, but that contrast does give some weight to the journey from Earth all the way to the alien homeworld, so maybe that's the point. One thing Dead Moon does handle consistently throughout the game, though, is the music. It's not quite in the top tier of Turbo game soundtracks, but it's pretty close, in large part thanks to the audio mixing, which is done extremely well here. Each instrument shines, but the overall sound is very smooth and pleasant to the ear, and the stereo separation in some of the drum fills is a really nice touch. There's a lot of great tracks here, but the theme for Stage 2 is probably my favorite. Can't go wrong with that. Now, Dead Moon does overpower its music with death explosions and some other sound effects on occasion, but not nearly as often as other games Gate of Thunder do. A little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Overall, I still think they did a great job with the sound and music here though, and it elevates the game considerably. Now, you do have 4 weapon types in Dead Moon, and they're nothing you haven't seen before. You got the standard green waves, the blue lasers, the pea-shooter spread shot that you tend to see in most shooters of the time, and even the little red circle things from Contra, so nothing special. But it is a perfectly functional arsenal all the same, and all the weapons will work just fine in pretty much any situation as far as I can tell. Although I do recommend avoiding the homing missiles entirely and just sticking to the spinning shield thingies as your options. These are way more effective at blocking enemy shots and protecting your ship than these slow-ass homing missiles will be in helping you in any way at all. Your bombs are somewhat understated, but they work well to break up enemies in a pinch and deal extra damage to bosses quickly, and that's the point. Speaking of which, each boss in Dead Moon has a skeleton theme and usually has a beating heart as a weak point, which is definitely a cool idea and makes them stand out in the genre. I also really like how the boss battles have you going all over the screen. The game automatically turns your ship around as needed as you and the boss fly around the screen trying to shoot each other, which is yet another one of those little things about Dead Moon that you don't see very often in the genre. Overall, Dead Moon is a great shooter. It doesn't make the best first impression, but I implore fans of the genre to really give this game just a little bit of extra time to grow on you. It's worth it. Another criminally underrated shooter on the Turbo that never really gets its due, in my opinion, is Cybercore. With the avalanche of shooters on the system and many of them borrowing a lot of thematic ideas from each other, Cybercore really stands out to me with its insect theme and crazy evolutions of your ship. Developed by Alpha System, who also had a hand in Sinistron, Cybercore is one of the better top-down shooters on the system, in my humble opinion. You start out as a little bug, but eventually get to choose between several different bug types, and each can be upgraded twice. And they each have different weapon types, although nothing totally game-changing for the most part, it really just comes down to preference. The downside of upgrading is that your ship becomes a much bigger target, so it's not always the right idea. If you do upgrade though, your ultimate form always looks insanely cool, as do all of the bosses and enemies. Most of the designs here are actually reminiscent of real insects, but also clearly take some wacky liberties with them. The bosses are also excellently designed, with crazy firing patterns, and they keep you guessing, with sometimes requiring bombs or regular fire to do damage. Also, bonus points for being able to change your speed with the select button. I find the base speed to be fine for most of the game actually, but you'll definitely want to turn it up in the last couple of levels. Gotta make a point to really shout out the soundtrack here. Composed by Masahiro Teramoto, who also worked on the music for Tricky Kick, which is really the only thing I like about that game. The soundtrack here in Cybercore is a stroke of genius. The melodies are epic and catchy, with lots of great bass parts and fluttering middle voices that really remind you of flies or bees buzzing around your ears. There's some great tunes in here, but the fact that they complement the insect theme so well really elevates the overall package. As cool as the level designs are, I guess I would have preferred a tad more detail in some of them. They can be a little on the bland side at times. There's also no scrolling layers to speak of, and very little animation in the backgrounds. But I guess in exchange for that, we do get a game that runs really smooth basically all the time, with almost none of the slowdown or flickering that a lot of other Turbo games suffer from. It's the great enemy variety, music, and upgradable ships to play around with that make this game excellent, and I highly recommend it. Regardless of how many shmups you've played, odds are pretty good you haven't played anything quite like this one. Psychosis is an exceedingly strange and difficult side-scrolling shmup that will quickly whittle down your lives with its, at times, severe challenge. Psychosis takes place inside an insane person's mind that's been taken over by an evil force, so you're here to eradicate it. Kinda like something you might catch the Magic School Bus doing, except with a lot more shooting and nightmare fuel. Taking place inside of a psychotic mind, of course, opens the floodgates for Naxat to throw every insane idea they could at it, and they very much did. Despite almost everything you see and hear being a baffling cacophony of nonsense, it kind of forms a strange sort of coherence that makes each level or cause really stand out. I really enjoy the presentation all around here. Lots of vivid colors and some scrolling layers here and there, giving the game a lot of depth. Also, the music sounds like it was written by King Crimson or something, and I really enjoy how the offbeat rhythms and unconventional chord structures complement the equally strange visuals. It all goes together really well. If I had to come up with any gripes, I guess it would be the moderate amount of visual glitches and slowdown that you do run into at times. It's really not that bad, and as any Turbo fan will tell you, you kinda learn to accept that in some of these games. Otherwise, though, Psychosis is basically flawless and comes highly recommended from me as long as you don't mind some pretty stiff challenge. You don't get a lot of lives and you will lose them often. This is also one of those shooters where you lose all of your power-ups every time you die, so good luck clawing your way back in later levels. This is one of the most underrated shoot-em-ups on the system, and thusly of all time. It's only got 5 levels, but given that you'll be dying a lot, I wouldn't worry about the game feeling short. Also, if you do somehow manage to beat it, you get thrown into a new game plus of sorts, where you get to keep your power-ups you beat the game with, but all of the enemy fire is a lot faster, and the enemies themselves take substantially more damage. So if your thumbs are still intact by this point, you can give that a whirl. Psychosis is phenomenal. Definitely give it a try. Dragon Spirit scratches a similar itch for me as Cybercore. It's not a stupendously great shooter mechanically, but it's good. And it's got a great theme, great graphics, and interesting music that complement each other well, which puts it over the top into the upper echelon, at least for me. Here we control a dragon, or I think a dude that became a dragon. Not too sure about the story here, but it does consist of rescuing somebody from a demon and having to turn into a dragon to do it. The power-ups here consist of a couple of different fire types as well as extra heads to multiply the fire, which is a neat idea. Also, like Cybercore, this is one of those shooters where you occasionally need to bomb things as well, including these colored egg things that give you your power-ups. Although some items can also be found in special enemies if you shoot them in time. The music here is great overall, albeit a bit inconsistent. Some tunes are kind of average, while some, like the song at the first level, are excellent and will be ringing in your head long after you've stopped playing. I really like how some of the soloing here shows off the Turbo's sound chip. The dragon character is a bit big, making you an easy target, and weaving around enemy fire somewhat awkward, which can sometimes result in hits that feel unfair, which is another thing you could say about Cybercore, although unlike that game, you have no control over how big you are in Dragon Spirit. You just gotta deal with it. Level designs also, while nice and distinct, don't always show a lot of depth with much in the way of animation or layers. So with those bugaboos in mind, I can sort of see why this game isn't brought up a whole lot, but I'm still willing to go to bat for it. It's got a lot of character, and the strong points with the soundtrack and the fun boss battles keep it in my good graces. It's also not terribly difficult compared to games like Raiden or R-Type. So it's got some casual appeal that makes it playable without necessarily requiring every single one of your brain cells to be focused on it. Cool game. So sure, while some of these might not have that instant curb appeal of, say, Soldier Blade or something like that, and some of them may take a while to bloom into their full potential, like Dead Moon really does, there's still plenty of value in exploring some of these games, and I hope I've made a compelling case for that here today. But in any case, big thanks to Shmup Junkie for having me on the channel. I've been a huge fan of this channel for a long time, so it's kind of surreal to actually contribute to it. And of course, feel free to check out my channel if you're so inclined. I have several more videos, pretty much just like this one. But until then, keep an open mind, keep exploring the genre, and thanks for watching.